Music's always played a massive part in my life for as far as I can remember. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Keith Woodhouse, and for years people have been saying to me, you should write down my bits and pieces, things that I've experienced, things that I've read, stories that I tell. But to me, that seems like hard work. So I think this is the easier way of doing it. So these are just short videos, just having a chat, really, as if I'm standing in a pub. My earliest memories really go back to when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and my dad gave me a transistor radio, one of those little box things, it's a tiny little thing. And I forever had that glued to my ear. Whenever I had the chance, that was on. And it was one of those where it was a tiny little tinny thing, and you couldn't hear it unless it was strapped to your head. And I used to listen to the pirate radio stations and get just whatever they played. You had no choice. It's like any radio station. You listen to a radio station, and in those days they were just pumping out pop music, and the quality of the reception wasn't that good. Then Radio 1 came along. I remember listening to the first song being played on Radio 1, and Tony Blackburn introducing it all, and I thought, this is great. This is going to be brilliant, hearing music as it should be. Then I sort of like moved on. I did different things, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I've always got music on. Whenever I'm around the house, I've got a little Echo Dot, so I tell, I'm not going to say the word, otherwise it's going to come on. So I tell that to play me some music, or if I'm in the kitchen, I've got a Google one, and I ask that to play me some music. And the great thing about streaming is you can pick and choose. Now, I know the arguments about how the artists get paid, one thing and another, but the point is that streaming is here to stay. So I do listen to streaming, but I've got so many tracks to listen to myself that I'll put my own stuff on. And once again, I'll have to come to that in future videos as to why I do have so much music. Years ago, when Radio 1 was sort of like, it would go into the evening, and there would be shows on that I wasn't that interested. So I'd listen to Radio Luxembourg. And Radio Luxembourg was brilliant. It was broadcasting from, as it says, in Luxembourg. And it was on AM radio. I think they were all on AM radio back in those days, to be fair. And what used to happen was that the station would fade in and out. It would just, you would hear a bit of the song, then it would go, and then you'd hear a bit more of the song, and then it would go again. And it was a really strange experience. But because it seemed so on the edge, and it was different type of music that they was playing, that I used to persevere with it. Now, I'm talking about primary school age when I was listening to this type of thing. So hearing that gave me a greater scope of music. And I think with Luxembourg, you heard part of the song one day and part the next day, depending on where it faded in and out. So I expect people, you will remember, if you're of a certain age, Radio Luxembourg. I don't know if it's still going today. If it is, it's going to be a lot more sophisticated than it was. But as I say, that was primary school age. Now, when I moved up to secondary school, I used to live in Shoreditch. And I went to school over in Hackney and Hackney Downs, and it was a different demography, really, and there were a lot of West Indians in that area. And during lunch times, we used to go out of school down to Shacklewell Lane and play pinball in a little cafe there, Pop's Cafe, and we used. I remember this vividly. We used to get a cheese roll and a cup of tea, and we thought we were Jack the Lad. We was probably about 12, 13 years old. And when we were in there was always West Indian fellas in there, and Pop used to have this jukebox. and the jukebox was just loaded with reggae imports, stuff that you just couldn't get. You didn't get import shops like you did today. And of course, you've got the internet. You can buy whatever you want. You can get it on MP3, you can get it on vinyl, you can just get whatever you want. In those days, it was entirely different. You had to get them direct from Jamaica. So these fellas were getting them shipped in. And that was where my love of reggae really came about, from going to Pop's Cafe. And they would be waiting for us to come in because they wanted to play us this music. And they were fantastic. And that was how I was drawn into the West Indian culture of music. Before it had been calypso and things like that. And this was ska moving from blue beat into full-blown reggae. And some of the things got a bit silly, because what they would do is they would take pop songs, as it were, and then do reggae versions of them. And I remember one pop song that I thought was absolutely awful, and it was Dawn's Knock Three Times. But the reggae version of it was so simple, so basic, it was absolutely brilliant. So they used to take these songs and do reggae versions of them. But there were bands that was playing their own music. People like the Wailers, who obviously became Bob Marley and the Wailers, and the Maytals. Well, actually, they became Toots and the Maytals, and I got to meet Toots many years afterwards. This has got to be 35 years on from those days that I got to meet Toots, probably even longer actually, and he put me right. He said it wasn't Maytals, because it's spelled Maytals, so of course you think it's Maytals, and he put me right, and he said no, it's Maytals, and he had a thing about that. It's Maytals, not Maytals, and I was quickly put in my place, but. I'll come on to that meeting in another video, because that is something completely different. I know I go off on tangents, but that is something completely different, how I got to meet Toots, and it was an absolutely marvellous experience. Now, on a Friday, or I think it was every other Friday, we used to go to Stoke Newington to a disco which was put on in a church hall. And we used to get dressed up in our Ben Shermans, our braces, Levi's. And I was going to say Dr. Martens, but you weren't allowed to wear boots into this disco. It was in a church hall. It was at St Matthias Church, and it used to be run by a fella called Skip. Big fella he was. And he'd stand on the door, and he would make you lift your trousers, and if you had boots on, you were not coming in, because in those days, wearing boots, they was known as bother boots, was a sign that you was out looking for trouble. So you had to wear shoes. So we wear loafers or brogues or things like that to go into this church hall. It was completely dark in there, and they had one ultraviolet light. It was like a bulb, it wasn't even a big tube thing, it was a bulb. And the thing about that ultraviolet light was it showed up all your dandruff. So you're trying to be cool with the girls. Not that we had any hair, it was all cropped back, it was all short cropped hair. But we still had dandruff. And you'd be in there, and if you had the dark shirt on, then it would show up. And it was very difficult to be cool with all this dandruff. And the more you brushed it, the more it showed up. And all they would play, all the DJs will play in there. When I say DJs, it would probably be one fella up there with a little deck, and he'd be up on the stage. And the next day, it'd probably be the church bazaar in there. The next day, it'd be Sunday school, But every other Friday, it was a disco for the teenagers. And we used to get on the bus and go down there. But the DJs, all they would play, totally exclusive, would be Tamla Motown, reggae, or Stax, proper soul music like Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Sam and Dave, things like that. They wouldn't play anything else. You could go up there and ask for the Beatles, and you go straight through the window. You had no chance. So that was all they were playing there. So that was my musical education, was listening to music which wasn't mainstream music. Although I was still listening to the radio and I was hearing this mainstream music, but my real love was the stuff that wasn't being played on the radio. You never heard reggae music on the radio in those days, never. And it was quite a few years afterwards that they caught up with this subculture, and this subculture is still going strong now. You have the Great Skinhead Reunion down in Brighton every year, and they put on lots and lots of reggae bands, lots of reggae DJs, and that scene is really, really strong. I still go and see reggae bands, old ones from back in the 70s up to youngsters who are doing it and playing it. So reggae is still probably my first love of music. But then as time evolved, and I started listening to other stuff, and we started to grow our hair a bit longer. We started coming out the skinheads into suede heads, and then it started getting a bit longer, and along came Rod Stewart, and he had his feather cut. Everybody wanted to have a feather cut, so all of a sudden we've gone to having nothing on our head to having these spiky hairs, you know, and over the years, which was unheard of 2 years previous. And he had his band, The Faces, and they bring out a Rod Stewart record and then a Faces record. And that was all down to them both getting two different record contracts with different labels. And Rod Stewart brought out Maggie May, and that was it. That I thought was the greatest record that had ever been made. And we started listening to Rod Stewart and The Faces. I got the album, Nods as Good as a Wink to a Blind Horse. Absolutely brilliant. Every Picture Tells a Story, the Rod Stewart album. And I thought Rod Stewart was great. And to a certain extent, I still do. I think it's brilliant the way that he still has that longevity. And he's not trying to do all the rock stuff that he did then. He's not playing football on stage. I remember him on Top of the Pops with John Peel pretending to play the mandolin. And Rod Stewart was kicking a football about, and he got... This is in the Top of the Pop studio. There's him and Ronnie Wood and Ronnie Lane all just kicking this football about on the stage. Anyway, another mate of mine at school, he played me Alice Cooper. He played me two songs, Be My Lover and Under My Wheels, and that was it. I never really listened to heavier rock music, and that was it. But I didn't really get into the band. You know, there was Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, they were all making a come through at that time. But for me, Alice was different gravy. He was a different class. His stage shows were legendary. And at the time, I never got to see him. So I could just read reports in the papers and see what was going on. And at one stage, an MP got him banned from coming in the country. And I read it in the papers, and he said he peddled the cult of the concentration camp, as I remember. Now, I don't know where he got that from. And it also, when he was questioned about it, he said he'd never seen Alice Cooper. Never actually seen him, but his children didn't like him, so he wasn't coming in the country to entertain all the people who wanted to see him. So, but that's another story anyway. We'll go on to that. And around about that time, someone showed me a picture of David Bowie, and I would say the first picture I saw of David Bowie, I was not taken with him, to say the least. My comments were rather derogatory, but once again, that is another that are videos on their own. My David Bowie stories are going to be sort of like they'll probably take up a number of videos, so I'm not going to go into that. But at the age of 16, I moved down to Fareham, and I lived 6 months while I started at Fareham College. I lived for 6 months with an aunt out in the middle of nowhere. But luckily, my cousin John, he had a car, and he dropped me off in Fareham and then go out for the night himself and then pick me up on his way back. So I got to go out. It literally was, their house was in the middle of nowhere. The nearest pub was, I would say it was about 2 miles down the road. And if I wanted to walk it to the pub, you were walking through the forest, the road through the forest. It was like Hansel and Gretel, I'm telling you. You had the houses on one side of the road, and on the other side of the road was forest. That was it. A beer forest. And not beer as in having a drink, a BERE, forest. So I was lucky that John would take me out and drop me off. And he was at the college as well. And I remember my first ever gig, going to see my first ever band live. The lineup was Man and Iguana. Now, when I've said this to people in later years, they said, "You saw Iguana," thinking it was Iggy and the Iguanas, which was Iggy Pop's first band. But no, it wasn't Iggy and the Iguanas, because the time that I actually saw them, Iggy was actually with the Stooges, and the Stooges was his band. So Iguana, I remember very little about, and it was in a hall. It was in a hall where I remember the only thing, apart from seeing gigs in there, the only thing I remember about this hall was doing my O levels and my A levels, and I don't know if it was ever used for anything else. This hall in the college, but. They used to put these gigs on, and Man played, and it was only a few years ago that Man have actually split up, I think. They were a Welsh rock band, maybe prog rock, something like that. But seeing my first band, that gave me the love of live music. And I have literally seen thousands of bands since then. Now, that might sound an exaggeration, but even today, now, I still go out 6 or 7 times a month to see a gig, and 2 or 3 bands will play. So even nowadays, I'm seeing 20 plus bands a month, you know. So over the years, I've just seen thousands upon thousands of bands. Some have been good, some have been not so good. But what I always think is someone has put a lot of work into making that band, writing the music, because I like to see original music. I love to see bands where I don't know their music, so it's all fresh, and I don't know what's coming. So that to me is still exciting after all these years. I've been going to gigs now, I almost said 40 odd years, 50, 55 years, and I still get excited by seeing new bands, seeing new talent. They don't have to be youngsters, they can be older. I see a lot of bands where people are in their 50s, 60s. But if they're playing music that is good, then I absolutely love it. So that was it. I used to go to the assembly rooms down in Fareham. I'd see sort of bands in there. I don't remember a lot of the bands. I am pretty sure that I may have seen Camel down there, who once again became a large prog rock band. But I wouldn't swear to that one. So it was a little room, there basically was a little hall in an alleyway in Fareham, as I remember it. And it didn't last for very long because they pulled it down. It was probably falling down, you know. But people used to go out their way. They used to put these gigs on, and I've never been into promoting bands. I tried it once, and that was it. Never again. I would never put a gig on. It's like herding cats, dealing with musicians. I tell you, it's like herding cats. But we'll come on to that in another video when I sort of like explain about how the musical progression went. Also, in 1973, which was just after I'd started going, I went to Reading Festival. In fact, before I went to Reading Festival, I was extremely lucky. I'll just talk about this bit. As I say, my cousin John, he was at Fareham Tech with me, and his mate was social secretary at a student union. And when I think of student unions, I think of demonstrations and sit-down strikes and all that, but we had none of that. All they did really was put on social events, and most of the social events were gigs. And John's mate, as I say, he was social sec, and Led Zeppelin were on a tour of the country, and at the time, they weren't as big as they were now, but they were massive. They got into the Guinness Book of Records, because in those days you didn't have credit cards. So if you wanted a ticket, you had to queue up and buy the ticket from the box office, or do it mail order. But on a tour like that, you had to queue up and get it. If you sent a letter in, you had no chance. You had to physically be there to get the ticket. And I believe they got in the Guinness Book of Record for selling out so many tickets in a record time for this tour. But they did one gig at Southampton University. They played the Southampton Gaumont the night before, and then Southampton University the night afterwards. And I've since heard a bootleg of this gig, and it was as good as I remember. So you've got to imagine Led Zeppelin, biggest rock band in the world, they're playing Southampton University. Have they got a big stage? Have they? Hell. They actually played in the refectory, which is the dining hall. The stage, if it was 3 feet high, I would say that's an exaggeration. And it was just sort of like blocks, I think. And they played on there, and everyone had to sit cross-legged on the floor, right? Because it was just a flat floor, and everyone sat cross-legged. And they played, and they played, and they played. And I went out to the bar to get a drink. Bearing in mind, I was 16, I was at the time. And it was either late 1972 or early 1973, I can't remember. And I went out to the bar and saw a few people who I knew in the bar. So they were sitting at the thing, and I got, I don't know, a Coke or something like that. And I'm standing there having a chat with them. All of a sudden, Led Zeppelin, there's people sitting around in the bar, you know, and they've sort of wandered out the gig and they're having a pint or whatever. And all of a sudden, Led Zeppelin launched into the opening of Whole Lot of Love, the dun-dun-dun-dun, and the place erupted. There's seats going everywhere, there's everyone rushing in, and they stopped, and this big crowd rushed in, me included. This big crowd rushed into the auditorium, and they stopped. And Robert Plant looked at all the people who had just come through the door, and he said, I thought that would get you in. And they went into another song. And it was an absolutely brilliant moment, a classic moment, absolutely impromptu. And he probably said to the band, let's do this, get them all in. And they went into another song. But what a brilliant night that was. Absolutely fantastic to see Led Zeppelin. And they played and played and played. They did 6 encores, proper encores, not the staged encores that you get. They came out, and at one stage, John Paul Jones came out and started playing keyboards, you know, just on his own, and it was fantastic. I got that name right, and the instrument as well. But it was absolutely fantastic. It was one of those things that I'm going to take to the grave. I'm never ever going to forget the time I saw Led Zeppelin. And I've never seen them since. And of course they are no longer. And they had the great John Bonham on drums as well, one of the greatest drummers I've ever seen, and Keith Moon being another one, and Kenny Jones, who played with the Faces, played with the Small Faces, then the Who, and Kenny, he was a great drummer. Well, he still is, probably still is. And I had the pleasure of meeting him a few years ago, but once again, that was an impromptu thing. I just sort of like was at his polo club for a festival and bumped into him because of where I was, and he had the time to stop, chat to me, have a picture taken, and he was such a lovely fella. And being in his bar, in his polo club, in the bar, there's a massive picture of him, Rod Stewart, I think Ronnie Wood's on there, might be Ronnie Lane. It's a painting, great big painting, and a sign above the bar which says, "Life is too short for cheap wine," which I thought was brilliant, although I'm not a wine drinker, but I do like the beer. And as I was saying earlier, I do tend to go off on tangents, don't I? As I was saying earlier, 1973 was my first ever festival. I went to Reading Festival, nothing like it is today. But once again, I think I've sort of like babbled on, so I'm going to cut this short. And I'm either going to come up with another topic, which won't be about music, or we'll carry on with the music conversation and hear my musical journey has gone. When I say my musical journey, it makes me sound like Neil Young or someone like that. I can't play an instrument, full stop. Can't play an instrument. When I was at primary school, I could play all 3 recorders, right? 2 the standard that I actually played at the Royal Festival Hall. I was pretty good at it. Then I could play the melodica. That's making a little bit of a comeback. I notice some bands are using melodicas in their shows now. And if you don't know what melodica is, it's well worth just Googling it and see if you can get a video of one playing. Very, very unusual instrument. And I was also learning the guitar. Look, you see, I can still do that bit. And I was learning the guitar. But once I moved to secondary school, that was it. Never picked up another instrument again. In fact, that guitar is sitting there in the corner. It never gets touched. It's an ornament. I had that guitar. I got it when I was 10 years old. I was given it as a present, and I've never learned it. And I do think now, I've got more time on my hands. Maybe I should learn it. I've got ukuleles. Used to go to a ukulele group. Never got further than playing a C chord. But that's another story. So we'll talk about the ukuleles another time. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. If you've got any thoughts, anything you want to say, please let me know, and I'll respond and answer any questions that you might have, or have a chat with you about any comments. If you do like it, please subscribe. It all helps. But thanks very much for listening.